Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. I've been on a Vietnam kick lately. It all started when the 4th of July was on the horizon. See, I was looking for something American, and Ken Burns is one of my all-time heroes. His documentaries always fill me with pride in America and what it means to be American. They don't shy away from the stains that are there, but they always focus on the better angels of our nature. In this case, I watched his series on the Vietnam War. That one's a little tough. It's very good, but those first-hand accounts of soldiers who were in the thick of some of the worst fighting, it can be difficult. But that put me on a Vietnam kick. I went on to watch Apocalypse Now, which I love, and Platoon. I'd never seen Platoon before. It was good, but some of the drama, especially after something like The Vietnam War by Ken Burns, kind of fell a little flat. But the first thing I noticed was that the sets on Platoon looked kind of fake. It all looked too green and too pretty, so I looked it up. I wanted to know what Hollywood sound set it had been shot on, and to my surprise, it wasn't shot on a stage. It was all really in the jungle. It just was that green and that pretty. However, it wasn't shot in Vietnam, nor was Apocalypse Now. They couldn't have been. I mean, Americans weren't super welcome in the Socialist Republic of Vietnam in the 70s and 80s. Instead, both films were shot in the Philippines. For good reason. Saigon, or as it's known today, Ho Chi Minh City, in terms of latitude, sits just about in the middle of Manila and Mindanao, and Saigon is about as far from Mindanao as Portland is to Denver. I think you can begin to see where this is headed. Today we're talking about the crew of the Signet in the Philippines, and if you want a visual representation of what the pirates there would have seen, those are all good examples. Do you want to see the beaches onto which William Dampier arrived? Well, you can watch Apocalypse Now. There was less surfing in the 1680s and less napalm in the morning, but the beaches weren't all that different. Do you want to see the jungle? Well, you can go watch Platoon. And if you want some raw, uncurated footage, even though it's across the South China Sea, you could do a lot worse than the Vietnam War by Ken Burns. But now it's time for us to return to the deck of Signet in Morro Bay, almost exactly 333 years ago, in early August, 1686. This is episode 124, The Wild, Wild East. When we left off last time, the quartermaster of Signet, Henry Moore, was being interrogated by Captain Charles Swan. He'd just returned from a night ashore in which he'd met the Sultan and his brother, in which he'd dropped off some gifts from Charles Swan, and had enjoyed the effects of the buy nut. Now the crew were deeply interested in the women of Mindanao, but Captain Swan and Mr. Harthop, the factor on board Signet, were less interested in that and much more interested in the Sultan. They wanted to know what he had to say. And do you remember those two men who sailed out to visit Signet the day before, the young and fancy one and the older, tougher one? Well, Henry Moore drug his mind through the fog of the previous night to drop a tiny, inconsequential little nugget that those two just happened to be the Sultan's brother and the Sultan's son and heir. Captain Swan was mortified by the news. He'd only given those two ambassadors a single-gun salute, and guests like that, well, they deserved a full complement barrage. It was a deeply embarrassing breach of protocol, but it was only the beginning. You might remember that those two ambassadors seemed very familiar with the crew of Signet. They acted as though they were welcoming old friends back once again. Well, it turns out that that's what they thought they were doing, sort of. They thought that the Signet was an official ship from the East India Company, and they thought that Swan was representing the corporation and that he was going to fight the Spanish. Now, some of the men on board Signet did want to fight the Spanish on behalf of the Sultan. Dampier wrote, quote, "Our men, who were squeamish of plundering without license, derived hopes from thence of getting a commission from the prince of the island to plunder the Spanish about Manila." End quote. A bunch of the crew wanted letters of marque so they could privateer for the Sultan. And that's reasonable, and not without precedence. Think back to John Ward. He was an Englishman turned pirate who had virtually no chance of ever returning to English society. Where could he go in that case? Spain and France were out. The Netherlands were still Spanish. Basically, his only option was a sultanate on the fringes of the Islamic world that wasn't super strict. A multinational, cosmopolitan sort of place that had a history of piracy committed by the locals. He sailed there, got the blessing of the Sultan, and robbed the Spanish. From the proceeds, he bought a house, got married, had a pack of kids, and retired. The crew of Signet were a bunch of Englishmen who turned pirate that had very little chance of ever returning to English society. Where could they go? Jamaica would have been the answer, but 3 years ago they'd started killing anybody even associated with pirates. North America was cracking down as well, so they sailed for a sultanate on the fringes of the Islamic world, a cosmopolitan sort of place with a history of piracy committed by the locals. Which is as good a place as any to touch briefly on the Moro people. When we talk about the non-Arabian Filipino people of Mindanao Island, we're talking about the Moro. Traditionally, the Moro were peaceful Buddhist farmers and fishermen. They were cultivators of rice and coconut, of mango and durian. I don't want to pigeonhole the Moro people here, but when Dampier and Signet arrived in 1686, they still grew rice and coconuts, but their primary industry was piracy. Originally, the Moro people had been from Malaysia. When the Islamic sultanates moved in there, they traveled to Borneo. When the Sulu Sultanate cropped up in Borneo, they sailed across the Sulu Sea to Mindanao. And here they were once again under the Islamic boot. By this point, most of them had converted to Islam, but they still sailed the Sulu Sea on the prowl for Hindu, Chinese, Portuguese, and Spanish vessels. Those vessels didn't know those seas very well, and they tended to get caught on the sandbars there. If that sounds familiar to you, that's exactly how the Bahamanian Pirates operated in the West Indies. These were oppressed people who knew their own seas, preying on the oppressors who did not. So the pirates here on Mindanao wanted to settle down and pull a John Ward. They wanted to serve as privateers of Mindanao. And in that respect, yes, they wanted to fight the Spanish. But that's not what the Sultan was thinking here. He was imagining the English East India Company and everything that entailed. Powerful waterfront fortresses that were filled with guns, fortresses that would employ a ton of locals in their militia. He was imagining armadas of first-rate ships of the line that would guard their shores and waters. And who knows? One of those ships of the line might just be carrying James, the Duke of York, who would stop by for a visit. That's what the Sultan had in mind when he was thinking of the English East India Company. And that put Charles Swan in an awkward position. He was not a representative of the East India Company, Signet was not a first-rate ship of the line, and his men, though talented warriors, were not exactly disciplined soldiers. But you have to make the best of an awkward situation. So Swan went ahead and made his preparations. He brushed his coat, and he shined his boots, and he combed his hair. Now maybe it's just because of the 4th, but this all makes me think of Washington crossing the Delaware. You're all familiar with that painting, right? George Washington standing in his boat with his lieutenant holding the Revolutionary flag. He and a motley crew of rebels forge their way across the icy Delaware River. It's a famous painting. So imagine that, put it in your head, only instead of George Washington looking imperious and majestic, you have fat Ebenezer Scrooge in a wrinkled coat. Instead of the brave, handsome generals of the Continental Army, you have a lawyer and a skinny scientist with no chin. And instead of the representative cross-section of America portrayed in Washington crossing the Delaware, you have a bunch of filthy, toothless pirates. But they put on a brave show nonetheless. They flew the English cross at their stern, and they blew their trumpets from the moment they disembarked Signet until they met the Sultan's agents on the shore. Charles Swan, William Dampier, Mr. Harthop, Mr. Smith, who spoke the best Spanish, and a coterie of others that possibly included John Reed and Henry Moore, made the same voyage that Mr. Moore had made the previous night. Only this time it was in the full light of day. They marched through the jungle into the bustle of a busy city. Today that city is called Cotabato City, but Dampier never uses that name. Instead, he calls it Mindanao or occasionally Maguindanao. I'm going to call it Mindanao. I'm not sure if it was called Cotabato City at the time, or if that came from later Spanish influence. When they emerged from the jungle, the full expanse of the city was visible before them. It was large, but it wasn't the sort of stone building and paved road city that Dampier and company would have been used to. I honestly wonder if they'd ever seen a large city that wasn't built in a classical style. These men had likely seen London, perhaps Madrid and Cadiz, maybe even Paris and Rome. Who knows, some of them might have even gone to Istanbul or Havana. But these buildings were mostly built of bamboo and palm. Instead of a city built in a large stone grid pattern, they were all built in and among the trees. There were roadways connecting all of the neighborhoods of Mindanao, but there were dense thickets of jungle that were kind of packed in around those neighborhoods. It looked sort of like the jungle was creeping in, although it appeared to have been that way for many, many years. It was designed that way for the very same reason that the houses were all on stilts, for the same reason that there was very little architecture at the shoreline, the typhoon. And for all of you meteorology geeks out there, I'm aware that cyclones aren't technically called typhoons in the southern Pacific Ocean, but that's a modern distinction. The Chinese, Hindu, and Muslim leadership who were in the Philippines at the time would have called them typhoons, and we could call them that, or we could call them hurricanes, or we could call them Pacific cyclones, or we could call them swirly boys, but we'd all know what we were talking about. Right about September, when the monsoon winds change, when they trap unsuspecting pirates in the Philippines, that's when typhoon season begins. When the winds start to blow, it's handy to have a bunch of trees to break that wind. When the monsoon brings the rains, the marshes fill, the tides rise, and the streets flood. So they built on stilts, and when the massive waves would strike the island's shoreline, it's better to have those waves hit a tree line than a harbor. But all that was in the future, for now it was a beautiful, sunny day in a tropical paradise. There was a river running through the center of Mindanao that was filled with people bathing and washing clothes and frolicking, oftentimes all three at once. This was a shock to William Dampier, in part because most of these people weren't wearing clothing, but I think even more shocking than that was that they were bathing in the first place. We'll talk about that at a later date, though. The markets of Mindanao were bustling. The smells of grilled meat and incense filled the air, and all of the people watched and smiled as the group of Englishmen passed them. All of these people had those black teeth and red-stained lips, thanks to the boy, but they were a lot less terrifying in broad daylight. And I'm going to quote one of the soldiers from that Ken Burns series on the Vietnam War. He was talking about his arrival as an 18-year-old boy in Vietnam. He said, quote, "What struck me was how beautiful Vietnam was to look at. There were just these endless acres of these jade-green rice paddies and these lovely villages inside groves of bamboo and palm trees, and way off in the distance these bluish jungle mountains. It looked like Shangri-La. I remember seeing this line of Vietnamese women, or schoolgirls I think they were. They actually looked like angels come to earth or something like that. So it was really quite striking, but a little unsettling, because how can a place like this, so beautiful and so enchanting, be at war? End quote. That's a beautiful sequence on film. It's filled with water buffalo and these sweeping vistas and these angelic girls who look so happy. They're happy to be there, and they're happy to welcome these young boys to Vietnam. They welcome them with flowers and kisses and these broad smiles. And that's how I imagine the crewmen of Signet arriving at Mindanao. They were taken to the Sultan's palace, and Captain Swan was brought to meet the Sultan himself. Swan chose to bring William Dampier and Mr. Smith with him. Sultan Barahaman was pleased to meet all three, and he offered them tea and tobacco and boy. At first the sailors eagerly accepted, but then they noticed that neither their host nor any of his attendants were partaking in any of it. And if you were ever a teenager who experimented with pot, you know that feeling. One of your friends lets you hit the bowl first. That's great, but when you go to pass it, they all giggle and say, "Nah, you go ahead," and the bottom drops out. That's never a good thing. It's probably going to be oregano or something much, much worse, and you are going to have a bad time. The Englishmen were suspicious when they realized nobody else was partaking, and they quite diplomatically inquired as to what was going on. But it turns out that it was all innocent. Dampier tells us it was the time of, quote, Ramdam, but of course he means Ramadan. The Muslims in Mindanao were observing their fast. They couldn't have tea or tobacco or boy, and they weren't able to offer any of the traditional entertainment in the Sultan's palace. The women were all busy praying in seclusion, and they wouldn't be able to come talk or dance. But, that kind of explains the party that Henry Moore had experienced the night before. That was at nighttime. They were breaking their daily fast, and they were having a good time doing it. But for now, that might be for the best. They offered the Englishmen those comforts, but they had business to discuss. Sultan Barahaman produced 2 letters. The first of these was in passable Spanish with a few Arabic kindnesses and blessings tossed in, but if the language was only passable, the letter itself was glorious. Dampier goes on and on about the parchment and the artful calligraphy. He notes the golden ink that separates every line on the page. This was an expensive letter. It was written by a London representative of the English East India Company. And I'm calling it the English East India Company because, well, first of all, we need to distinguish it from the Dutch and French companies. And even though the East India Company is much better known to history as the British East India Company, the United Kingdom of Great Britain didn't exist yet, so it was still the English East India Company. Officially, it was the Honorable East India Company. More informally, though, it was just called the EIC. However, to the common Englishman, to Dampier, in his text, for example, they were simply called the Company. We're going to talk about them in some depth next time, but we do need to touch on how they were viewed by the English in the 1680s. You know how today Facebook, Apple, and Google control everything in the world? How literally 40% of the internet is hosted on Amazon servers? How when people decide that they're going to boycott social media, they do so by announcing their boycott on social media. Everyone knows this, and no one is really happy about this state of affairs, but what are you going to do? Stop using the internet? Well, if you lived basically anywhere in the world for about 300 years or so, your life was impacted and on some level reliant on one or another of these massive trading conglomerates. When Swan and Dampier saw that letter, it's as though they saw a letter that was signed by one of Mark Zuckerberg's lawyers. That letter detailed a proposal by the company to build a factory in Mindanao, and the Sultan was very supportive of that. The English East India Company, would aid him in the war against Spain, and they would provide a pipeline to world markets. Swan had to explain that he was not a representative of the company, but the Sultan countered. They had a perfect spot picked out for the factory already. They had it cleared and everything. They had all the building materials ready and had a team of men ready to start construction immediately. The fortress was there. It was just waiting for a bunch of Englishmen to command it. They could buy and sell spices from all around the Moluccas. They could grow rich and they could grow powerful. They could have their pick of those angelic Moro girls. Swan deferred. This was not his position, but he didn't defer too strenuously. I mean, he couldn't just stay in the Philippines. He had responsibilities back in London, but maybe something could be arranged here. I mean, imagine if he returned to London with a ship that was full of silk and nutmeg and gold. And imagine that he returned with news that he'd overseen the construction of a factory intended for the East India Company. If they just gave him the ships and the men, well, he already knew the island. He already had a rapport with the Sultan. He could be an official representative of the Honorable East India Company. Be absolutely certain that this was going through Captain Swan's mind. But Dampier wasn't interested in all that. He was reading the second letter that the Sultan had provided, and that one was in English. It was in a significantly less flowery hand, and it didn't have the gold ink. It was written by an Englishman named Captain Goodlud. He had been the captain in charge of the expedition to Mindanao by the East India Company that had brought that previous letter to the Sultan. He was the representative that discussed setting up this factory on Mindanao with the Sultan. Presumably, that letter was intended for the East India Company representatives that would follow to build the factory, but instead it fell into the hands of Swan and Dampier. Most of it wasn't that interesting. It detailed the trade deal that had been worked out between Goodlud and the Sultan. It had exchange rates for silver and gold and all sorts of different goods. It had the prices that would be set for commodities to be bought by the company. And I mean, it was the sort of information that would be extremely important for whatever company man came to set up that factory, but it wasn't necessary information for the pirates. However, it did contain one nugget I want to mention. Dampier talks of it, and when he says the general, here he's referring to Raja Laut, the Sultan's brother. He writes, quote, "Captain Goodlud's letter concludes thus," quoting Goodlud here, "Trust none of them, for they are all thieves." And Dampier continues, "We understood afterwards that Captain Goodlud was robbed of some goods by one of the general's men, and that he that robbed him fled into the mountains and could not be found while Captain Goodlud was here." End quote. This is an example of that Moro piracy of which we spoke earlier. More on that in a second, though. For now, the Sultan excused the Englishmen after their pleasant but not exactly productive meeting. They did find some common ground, and there was potential for a relationship there, but nothing was set in stone. Outside the palace, Captain Swan, Dampier, and Smith found the rest of the men relaxing. They were all chewing on buy that had been proffered by a group of beautiful young women. The women were all giggling and smiling and attempting to communicate in broken Spanish. The men outside were having a great time. But there was another man there as well who wasn't from the crew of the Signet. We can imagine him talking to Henry Moore familiarly because they knew each other, although maybe he was using Moore to talk to the rest of the crew. This was Raja Laut, and Raja Laut was the sort of guy that the crew of Signet could identify with. He was tough as nails, he was a warrior, and, well, he was a naval man. He was the Admiral of the Mindanao fleet. But he was also the kind of guy that, even during Ramadan, would bring women and drugs to the party. And in case there's any confusion here, Raja Laut was not a Hindu Raja. He was the Muslim brother of Sultan Bahman, but they had made Raja a princely title on Mindanao. It was a move that would placate the Hindu element on the island, but it would also relegate the role of Raja to a secondary status. I mean, it's an old imperial move. Sort of like the Romans marching in and taking over and saying, yes, you can keep your kingship and all of your ancestral titles. Just remember that I'm the emperor. And, the Normans did the same thing when they conquered England. It's an ancient tactic here. But Raja Laut was busy ingratiating himself with the men of Signet. He asked Captain Swan if they would like to bring the crew ashore. Swan was hesitant here, but Laut attempted to persuade the captain. He warned Swan that the weather would be growing tempestuous, which it very much would be, and he told Swan that some of the Moro might harbor nefarious designs against the English. For the moment, Captain Swan deferred, but he did bring Signet in closer to land, and he brought much of the crew ashore. When nighttime finally fell and all of the tiki torches were lit, Raja Laut had pavilions erected and hammocks set up for the men. And then he had pots of steamed rice and buffalo meat brought in. Some of the women of the island brought gifts to the party, and they gave those to some of the crew. And I'm sure at the moment most of those men thought, oh yeah, she's all over me, and many of them very likely did find some company that evening, but that's not what these gifts were about. That's part of a whole cultural tradition on Mindanao that we're going to talk about later. Still, though, it's pretty great. Here's food and here's women giving you flowers and pretty baubles. That's a good time. The Filipino men on the island invited the crew to take part in a contest. Oftentimes, these sort of masculinity contests are the sort of thing that just sound awful to me. Usually they sound painful, but this one I can get behind. Every man had a bowl of rice and a bowl of water before him. They dipped their hands into the water, and then they grabbed as much rice as they could. They squeezed the rice down. They compacted it into tight balls, first, maybe softball size, and then baseball sized, and then smaller and smaller. When they had a tight, small, compact ball of rice, they grabbed yet more rice and added it to their ball and squeezed it until they had all of the rice that they thought could conceivably fit into their mouth. Then they popped the rice ball in and had to chew it and swallow it. Spit it out, you lose. Choke, you lose. And in the end, whoever managed to swallow his ball of rice and had the least amount of rice left in the bowl would win the contest. Once it came time for the Muslims to break their fast, they came and joined the festivities, and they partied all night. Anybody who was anybody on Mindanao was here, meeting and mingling with the crew of Signet. Everybody was sharing food and tea and buai and hashish. They played bamboo flutes and they played xylophones. The women danced and the men showed their weapons off to one another. Everyone was getting along famously. This is why I like pirates so much. When the locals offer up food and good times, instead of returning the favor with rape and murder as so many other people did, the pirates just enjoyed themselves. And, let's not pretend that pirates were never guilty of rape and murder and robbery. They absolutely were. That's kind of what makes pirates pirates. But when they committed those crimes, they did so against the Spanish Empire or the Royal Navy or the East India Company. They did it against their enemies. When they were offered hospitality, they didn't abuse it. And we see this in a ton of other places. The Mosquito people in Nicaragua, the Guna people of Darien, the Malagasy of Madagascar, and here, the Moro of Mindanao. And not just the Moro on Mindanao. There were a bunch of people here. There were the Muslim elites of the city, sure, but there were also some Chinese merchants here, which I doubt any of the Englishmen had ever met anyone from China before. And perhaps even more surprisingly, there were a few Spaniards in the crowd. We're going to meet them in far greater detail later on. For now, though, the crew of Signet impressed Raja Laut as, well, one doesn't want to say men of honor because they weren't, and respectable doesn't fit either, but Raja Laut liked the men of Signet. Remember that bit about the thief who had robbed Captain Goodlud some time before? Well, Dampier continues that story the morning after this little shindig. He writes, quote, "The fellow, returning back to the city some time after, Raja Laut brought him bound to Captain Swan, desiring him to punish him as he pleased. Captain Swan excused himself and said it did not belong to him, therefore he would have nothing to do with it. However, Raja Laut would not pardon him, but punished him according to their own custom. He was stripped stark naked in the morning at sunrising, and bound to a post so that he could not stir hand nor foot, and was placed with his face eastward against the sun. In the afternoon they turned his face towards the west, that the sun might still be in his face, and thus he stood all day, parched in the sun, which shines here excessively hot, and tormented with the mosquitoes and gnats. After this, the general would have killed him if Captain Swan had consented to it. Sometimes they lay them flat on their backs on the sand, which is very hot, where they remain a whole day in the scorching sun, with the mosquitoes biting them all the time." End quote. Now that sounds awful, yes, but that's not really the point here. To me, this signals a sign of acceptance of the crew of Signet, a sign of trust and goodwill. I mean, here's this general, this admiral, the second most powerful man on Mindanao, at least, by his title. Arguably, he was the most powerful man on Mindanao. And he brings out the man who had wronged one of your countrymen, one of his people, and he offers you the opportunity to exact justice on this man. But when you decline, he goes ahead and doles that justice out himself. It's kind of a courtship ritual. He was trying very hard to show the English here that he was on their side. And it worked. Following this demonstration, Captain Swan decided to trust Raja Laut. He ordered the crew to bring the Signet in and park it in a spot pointed out by the Raja in the river. And that decision, as it turned out, would doom him. Over the following weeks, the crew of Signet would ingratiate themselves into the community of Mindanao. They had a several-month-long stay ahead of them until the winds changed, and they decided they would make the best of it. Today we're going to introduce the villains of our story, not just our current narrative of William Dampier in Southeast Asia, but the villains of our whole overarching story, the big bad of pirates and piracy. And it's not pirates. It's not the Royal Navy, nor is it the Windward Fleet. If I could be forgiven a Lord of the Rings analogy here, those two institutions would be the Grima Wormtongue and Saruman of this tale. Villains, to be sure, but pawns and occasional rivals of Sauron, the big, faceless evil that casts a shadow over everything in the world. And if the topic of today's episode is Sauron, the big bad of Lord of the Rings, the Spanish Empire would be Morgoth. My fellow Tolkien nerds know who Morgoth is, and if you don't, you probably don't much care. In Tolkien's Legendarium, he's the devil. He's the one who corrupted the elves to create the orcs, and he's important to this analogy because Sauron, the topic of today's show, rose to power following the fall of Morgoth. He rose in the ruins of the empire that Morgoth built. For all of you whose eyes just glazed over, allow me to explain. Spain and her empire were responsible for many of the evils of the early modern world. Slavery and genocide and the crushing weight of empire on untold millions of indigenous people. And the topic of today's story rose from the crumbling ruin of the Spanish and Portuguese empires. And like Sauron in The Lord of the Rings in the Third Age, they were faceless. They had no monarch, they had no president upon which all of their evils could be blamed. Instead, they built a system of corporate, bureaucratic, faceless anonymity. This is episode 125, Pirates Incorporated, Part 1. We are, of course, talking about the East India Company, the English East India Company today, and we're talking about the English because they came first, but we will move on to the Dutch very soon. To begin, let's discuss, very, very briefly, the history of business in the European sphere, or rather, the history of organized business. And these are going to be extremely broad strokes because I am way out of my comfort zone on this. If you take it back to ancient Rome, they had organized group of artisans and merchants called collegium. Among the most famous and relevant of these was the Corpus Naviculariorum. They were a guild that specialized in long-distance naval shipping. In many ways, they controlled the Mediterranean. When the Roman Empire started to crumble, the collegium system began to dissipate. Throughout much of Europe, trade reverted to small, independent operators. However, Europe began to pick up the pieces, and by the High Middle Ages or so, we see the rise of what's called the guild system. The guilds looked similar to the collegium, but they were usually smaller in scope, more localized, and they tended to hold their secrets very close. There are some scholars who would argue that they actually impeded progress by keeping their secrets to themselves. But the guilds are where we get that tiered apprentice, journeyman, and master system. If we are following large maritime trade organizations, and we are, we should mention the Hanseatic League. They, during the High and into the late Middle Ages, controlled Baltic Sea trade. They defended that sea against pirates, as well as their ships and cargo and harbors. The Hanseatic League was responsible for making northern Germany a ton of money. They and the other guilds played a prominent role in building the continental middle class that some would say led to the Reformation. We're going to focus more on that schism next time, but for now we can break it down like this. By the late 1500s, you have your Protestant territories, your German, Danish, Dutch, Nordic, and English areas, and they were largely using a system based upon guilds and the investment of capital into private ventures. That was opposed to Spain and Portugal and France and Italy, the Catholic kingdoms of Europe, who favored a system that was called, derisively at first, mercantilism. That split is only another layer on top of the cultural and religious divide that we've explored on this show many times, but again, put a pin in that for next time. For now, we're going to turn to the late 1500s in Elizabethan England. We've talked before, quite a bit in fact, about why Queen Elizabeth employed the use of privateers for the English Navy. England was poor. Too poor to do things the way that, say, Spain did them, with a top-down sort of royal navy that was filled with officers who were paid by the crown, officers who were usually chosen for their name and could often be completely incompetent. They were the sons of nobles and dignitaries, not the sons of sailors. The English crown couldn't afford any of that, but they could afford the ink and paper necessary to sign letters of retribution, licenses that would allow talented sailors' sons to go out privateering. And as we'll see, the best of these, the most talented and most successful, rose to positions of power and prominence in Elizabeth's England. The Queen had a similar approach to empire and to trade. Elizabeth would sign royal charters to form companies. Now, there were two main types of companies founded here. There were the trade companies who bought the rights directly from the crown to trade with Russia or the Ottoman Empire or Spain or really almost anywhere, but they bought a monopoly on that trade. And then there were the companies that were designed to settle colonies. Most of these came a little bit later, but there were a few in Elizabethan England, like the Virginia Company, named for the Virgin Queen. Both of these types of companies are what were called joint stock companies, and in fact, most modern companies today are joint stock companies at their core. It essentially means that the people with capital to spare can invest in one of those ventures and expect a profitable return. The voyage of, say, Charles Swan and the Signet, that was based upon a joint stock venture that had investors back in England. These sort of companies were all the rage in Elizabethan England. The Queen, in lieu of a fat treasury, empowered talented people to build the British Empire. She also empowered some not-so-talented people who had the money to buy a license, but we don't remember their names. Those who we do remember invested their own capital to set up colonies and trade relations with foreign nations. This wasn't capitalism, but it was kind of a proto-capitalism. However, it was a Protestant policy that was born out of Elizabethan necessity, as was so much during her time on the throne. The kings who would follow, the Stuart dynasty, who were all about that Catholic life, would shift to a much more mercantilist economic policy. But that's far in the future. For now, we're in Elizabeth's England, in a wild west of capital investment in bold voyages that have the potential for fantastic returns. All of it at the expense of a crumbling Iberian empire. We started this show more or less in the Elizabethan age when we were talking about Sir Francis Drake. Following our discussion on Drake, I made a decision. I anguished over it a bit, but I decided to skip ahead into the good stuff, the West Indies and Henry Morgan, the stories of the Buccaneers. And I'm glad I did. I really wanted to talk about all that, but I did skip over a ton of interesting connective tissue. Today, we're going to rectify that. If you think back to Francis Drake's first major voyage, it wasn't one of his, it was under another commander, an Englishman named John Hawkins. That's the voyage, the famous voyage of the Jesus of Lubbock. It was the voyage on which a crew of English privateers circumvented that Spanish mercantilist system. They captured slaves from the Portuguese and sold them at a steep discount to the Spanish colonists in Mexico and terra firma. They made a boatload of money, several boatloads of money in fact, but they were attacked by the Spanish under a flag of truce, and when they returned to England they did so in tatters. Still, they made a massive profit, and in doing so they gained Queen Elizabeth's personal interest. John Hawkins, the man in charge of that voyage, was, in some respects, the father of modern English naval tradition. Maybe he would be better described as the grandfather. Admiral Pepys should probably be the father, but so much of what was to come stemmed from Hawkins, both legal traditions and illegal ones. Hawkins would go on to pen a memoir about his voyage called A True Declaration of the Troublesome Voyage of John Hawkins to the West Indies. That book was something of a primer for the gentlemen adventurers, for the men who would go on to become a generation of Elizabethan privateers. And when I say privateers, I do of course mean pirates who were sanctioned by the Queen. Francis Drake was the most famous of these, but he was far from the only one. Now, Drake and Hawkins were related. Drake was Hawkins' second cousin, probably, but both would eventually earn knighthood and become admirals. In Elizabeth's England, this was the best way to become an admiral. It showed that you had the influence and the know-how to raise a fleet, and the money to do so should, say, the Spanish decide to invade. John Hawkins went on to serve as naval treasurer and as admiral of the Narrow Seas. That post put him in command of the fleet that guarded the English Channel and the North Sea between England and the Netherlands. He received this post at the outbreak of the Anglo-Spanish War, and it turned out to be a fairly important position in a time when his nation was at war with Spain in the English Channel and in the North Sea between England and the Netherlands. With Hawkins serving as naval treasurer, Francis Drake took over American operations. He led the famous 1571 raid on Nombre de Dios, which we talked about and which inspired generations of English pirates and treasure hunters. On his next major voyage, the voyage of circumnavigation, Drake was accompanied by one of his cousins, a nephew of Admiral Sir John Hawkins named William Hawkins. William served on board Golden Hind and was fast-tracked for command. He was a talented seaman with a good name. William Hawkins also served with Drake on his next major venture, the 1586 voyage of privateering in the Americas, and they were joined by another one of their cousins, a man named Richard Hawkins. Richard Hawkins would captain a galliot on that voyage, which was a proper position for the son of the Treasurer of the Navy, John Hawkins. Most of the officer corps on board most of these voyages was in some way closely connected. They were all from Devon, and many of them were family members, which made it all the worse when the crew began to suffer the effects of scurvy. Drake was feeling the very early effects, but the two Hawkins boys were not doing well. So Drake decided to make landfall near some friendly Indians who would treat his men. They gave them a concoction of mint and lime and chuchuasi bark. The stuff worked, but it tasted awful. So Drake added some sugar, probably molasses actually, and the men all got better. In order to preserve the concoction for the rest of his voyage, Drake added some rum to it, and the men found that this tasted pretty good. And of course, this is the origin of the drink known as the El Drake and the ultimate origin of the mojito, according to legend. Richard Hawkins' life was saved on that voyage by that drink. Some years later, when he was a naval admiral and one of the most powerful maritime forces in England, he would suggest that drink, suggest a mix of lime and mint and rum to combat scurvy on the high seas. This became an English naval tradition. Eventually, some years later, it would become official policy, and it was also the basis of the nickname that was given to the English people, Limey. In 1588, the Lord Howard Effingham, High Admiral and Privy Councillor to the Queen, arrived in Plymouth. The Spanish were massing a fleet, and rumor was they were planning to invade England, and he was there to command the forces that would defend England against them. The High Admiral wrote of the men that he met there at Plymouth, quote, "My good lord, there is here the gallantest company of captains, soldiers, and mariners that I think ever was seen in England." End quote. That gallantest company of men included the Vice Admiral of the entire English Defence Force, Sir Francis Drake. It also included the Rear Admiral, who served a very important position in this battle, Admiral Sir John Hawkins. There were others. There was the captain of the warship Griffin, who was William Hawkins, and the captain of another of the Queen's warships, Richard Hawkins. Everyone who was anyone in the naval world was at this battle. Of course, England won that affair, thanks to some helpful weather in large part, but the Spanish were repelled. William and Richard Hawkins rose to positions of some prominence in the English maritime world, as did many of the other men who fought in that battle. Another of the gallantest company of captains, soldiers, and mariners that ever were seen in England was another lad from Devon, another privateer, another man on the fringes of piracy that was turned through Elizabeth's grace into a gentleman adventurer. His name was Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was, even more so than Drake, I would argue, the consummate gentleman adventurer. He was one part pirate and scoundrel, one part explorer, and one part courtly romantic. He's the kind of character that 19th century poets would write ballads about. A gentleman in disguise, the sort of man who fooled the bumbling Spanish lord and who wooed their wives for a night of steamy passion, only to run off in the morning with a bag of rubies and gold. At least that's the image that Sir Walter Raleigh cultivated. His personal vessel, his commissioned ship, the Ark Raleigh, was the flagship in the 1588 battle against the Spanish Armada. But Raleigh wasn't commanding his ship. He'd in fact given it to his queen. She'd rechristened her the Ark Royale and given command over to the Lord High Admiral. The rumors that surrounded Sir Walter and Queen Elizabeth were many. And, he flirted with her at court, as was the tradition, but it probably never went any farther than that. He was popular, but he never appears to have been a favorite, and not the sort of man that she invited for her late-night gaming sessions. Raleigh was, of course, integral in the Virginia Company and in the founding of the New England colonies. Raleigh was most definitely a Queen's man, but I think, at heart, he was a pirate. In accordance with the image he chose to cultivate, Raleigh wooed one of the Queen's attendants, one of her ladies-in-waiting, and got her with child. However, he did marry her, but they did so in secret. See, Elizabeth demanded all marriages of any of her ladies-in-waiting be approved by her personally, and Elizabeth was known to make her ladies-in-waiting wait for it, in one case as long as 10 years. But Sir Walter and the lady in question, Bess Throckmorton, didn't have that sort of time. She would, of course, start to show signs of pregnancy very shortly. So they were married in secret, but when Elizabeth found out about it, both of them were tossed in the Tower of London. Elizabeth did have something of a temper about this. Some have suggested that it's because she was denied the pleasure of a romance herself, and perhaps there's something to that. And then, in 1592, two major events took place. The first of these seemed at first glance to be nothing at all, almost a non-entity. It involved a group of intrepid English sailors whom we have not yet met: James Lancaster, George Raymond, and Samuel Foxcroft. They were merchants working for the Levant Company when they received special permission from the Crown to sail for the Indies. It wasn't a voyage that anyone, from their company to the Queen, had much faith in at all. The Indies were really far away, and the English had no support mechanism there. Instead, they would face Portuguese ports and ships that would be more likely to attack or arrest them should they run into the Portuguese. Still, those three men set sail in their three ships, Penelope, Merchant Royal, and Bonaventure. They rounded the Cape and made their way across the Indian Ocean, and in February 1592 they careened in Zanzibar, and by April they had reached Malaysia. In Malaysia, many of the crewmen threatened to mutiny and kill the officers if they did not return home, so they did so. They lost a lot of men on that voyage, and even though they did bring back a few spices, no one really got rich. They did, however, make some contacts along the way. A couple of sultans, a couple of rajahs, some local leaders. No big deal at the time. This whole voyage appeared to have been something of a bust. At that same time, Queen Elizabeth's personal champion, her own personal knight at court, petitioned her for the release of Sir Walter Raleigh. That knight was George Clifford, the Earl of Cumberland, and the Earl had a mind to steal himself some Spanish gold. The Earl wasn't a naval man. He was a knight. Horses and armor and jousting and sword fighting, that kind of thing. In fact, he was chosen to be the Queen's personal champion because of his talent at the tilts. He wanted Sir Walter Raleigh to lead this expedition he had planned. And I kind of suspect here that the Earl was using this opportunity to give his Queen a good reason to release Sir Walter Raleigh. And I suspect that the Queen knew that. I imagine she silently thanked him for giving her that opportunity without losing any face. Then again, this fleet was a big deal. There was a lot of money behind it, and Sir Walter may have simply been the best choice available to command it. Sir Francis Drake might have been better, but at the moment he was away in the Americas. Now, this fleet was organized by the Earl, and he had a lot of his own money in it, but it was one of those joint stock affairs. A lot of people had money in this venture. Everyone who was anyone, except for Drake, in the naval circles of England had a stake in it. And the formation of this fleet was kind of a key moment. If we were to use another Lord of the Ring analogy, this would be the Council of Elrond. First, we need to talk about the ships in the fleet, more specifically their design. They were race-built galleons, or Razi galleons. The Razi galleon was smaller and lighter and faster than the traditional Spanish galleon, but it had a lot more firepower than the frigates which would eventually replace them. The design was thought up by John Hawkins and Francis Drake and brought to the table by Hawkins himself. Now, Admiral Hawkins wasn't there. He was busy being the treasurer of the Navy, but he had a substantial stake in the venture, perhaps second only to the Earl. His son Richard was there, though, in his bright and shiny new galleon, the Dainty. I don't think that William Hawkins was there, at least there's no mention of him being there, so I suspect he was probably with Francis Drake in America at this time. The fleet consisted of a total of 16 ships. Sir Walter Raleigh was in overall command on board the Queen's ship Garland. Raleigh named John Burrough Vice Admiral, who sailed on board the ship Roebuck. As we said, Richard Hawkins sailed Dainty, while a Captain Newport sailed the Golden Dragon. That's a not unsubtle nod to Drake's The Golden Hind. A captain named Samuel Purchase sailed another of the Queen's personal vessels, the Foresight, and the Earl himself brought in 3 ships, Prudence, Tiger, and Samson. Once everyone was provisioned and ready, the fleet set sail on 6th May 1592 with a southwesterly heading. The very next day, when England was barely out of sight, lookouts spotted an English ship coming up from behind. It was a fast-moving pinnace named Disdain, under the command of one Martin Frobisher. Frobisher had a letter from the Queen for Sir Walter Raleigh. God, I love Queen Elizabeth. And this is part of the reason I suspect she knew exactly what the Earl was up to when he asked her to release Raleigh, and I suspect she did not inform the Earl of this part of the plan. Raleigh had been out of port for a day, a single day, and this letter arrives from the Queen admonishing him for gallivanting off on this crazy mission. I mean, there's a squadron of Spanish ships massing off the coast. What do you think you're doing out there, Raleigh? Get back here and defend your Queen. And remember that Raleigh was only out of prison in the first place because Elizabeth's champion begged her to release him for this mission. And here's the thing. There actually was a Spanish fleet massing out there, but they were formed specifically to deal with this fleet under Walter Raleigh. Nobody knew what their plan was, but they had no intention of invading England. They were intending to sail out to combat this fleet. But the Queen did fear that invasion was imminent, and she wanted Raleigh at court where he belonged, and Queen Elizabeth always got what she wanted. And what was Sir Walter's wife doing during all of this? Well, she was still in the Tower of London for the detestable crime of marrying this guy that the Queen demanded be at court. Elizabeth is just the best. Raleigh gave his final orders to split the fleet up between Frobisher and Burrough. Frobisher would be given ultimate command, with Burrough still serving as Vice Admiral, but really it was 2 fleets now. The Earl of Cumberland, with his ships, sailed with Burrough, and then Raleigh returned to England on the command of his Queen. The fleets were hit by a pretty terrible storm shortly after splitting up, so then they had to reconnect to see if anyone needed aid. Some repairs were needed, but the ships were intact. They did stick together for a couple of weeks after that, which proved to be a smart decision, as they spotted a 600-ton Spanish galleon called the Santa Clara. They chased her down and engaged in a heated battle, but the Santa Clara fell into English hands. Now, it wasn't a rich prize, it was hauling mostly iron, but it was a powerful ship. They incorporated it into their fleet, under the Earl, in fact, and then the fleet split up once again. Frobisher had a smaller contingent, but he headed south to hopefully intercept some treasure galleons that were rumored to be coming up from the East Indies. He didn't have any success in that. The only prize of any real consequence he found was a flyboat, a tiny thing, but it was carrying one important passenger. That passenger was a messenger who was zipping up and down the coasts of Africa and Portugal, relaying messages between the naval headquarters at Cadiz and the incoming fleet of East India treasure ships. After about 2 weeks of torture, this messenger finally spilled the beans. He had news of that fleet that he gave to Frobisher and of the Spanish armada that was massing to destroy all of these gentlemanly English privateers. This was important information. Frobisher knew that everyone needed to know about this, so he shot off a messenger ship to let the other men know about this incoming treasure fleet and of her rumored route and of the incoming Spanish armada. That word never made it to Burrough or the Earl. However, it was too late for Frobisher to send off another messenger as he was chased back to England by some Spanish coast guard. But they weren't out of luck entirely. Through one of those amazing twists of fortune, the second half of this fleet, the one under Burrough and the Earl, had made their way to the southern Azores. That's why they weren't found by the messenger. Nobody knew they were going to be out there, and they were out there because they'd spotted a Spanish caravel. They'd given her chase, but they were unable to capture the caravel before the ship made an emergency landing on one of the nearby islands. The crew disembarked, carrying as much cargo as they could, and then they set the caravel ablaze and ran inland. However, Clifford sent 100 men ashore and did so in time to capture a few of the lagging Portuguese sailors. Now, this wasn't about cargo. This was all about information. They may have missed that messenger from Frobisher, but this was better. These men, some of whom weren't Spanish or Portuguese, but were instead North African slaves, told them everything. They told them about the massing Spanish armada, and they told them about the incoming Spanish and Portuguese treasure fleet. They learned that there were 5 carracks headed for the Azores Islands, specifically for Flores Island, the northernmost island in the Azores. Those 5 carracks were the Santa Cruz, the Buen Jesus Admiral, Madre de Dios, San Bernardo, and San Cristoforo. This was an amazing array of ships. All 5 of these vessels were unlike anything that England had to offer. Well, almost anything. They looked quite a bit like the flagship commissioned by King Henry VIII, the Henry Gracchia Dieu, but that was a royal vessel, while these were just treasure carracks, and there were 5 of them. The greatest of these 5 was, in fact, probably the greatest ship in the entire Portuguese navy, the Madre de Dios. She was a 32-gun vessel of 1,600 tons. That ship was a behemoth. I mean, it wouldn't be out of place in a 19th century dockyard. It wouldn't look out of place among the tall ships of the Napoleonic War or even the Civil War. And aside from a few changes in hull design, it looked a lot like the first-rate ships of the line that still wouldn't be around for another 70 years. It was a big ship, an impressive ship. The biggest difference between the Madre de Dios and the first-rate ships of the line that would follow some decades later was the number of guns on board. See, a first-rate ship of the line in the English Navy, or any European Navy, usually required at least 100 guns on board, but this Portuguese ship carried only 32. That was not an oversight. I mean, first of all, 32 guns is still an impressive array of firepower, especially in the 1500s, but those 70-odd missing guns were not there for a reason. Guns were heavy, and they took up a lot of room on board a ship, and that space was needed. The Madre de Dios was carrying treasure. Imagine how much treasure could be stored in the space that would normally be taken up by 70 large cannon, not to mention the stores of gunpowder and shot, and the men necessary to fire those cannon. So the English had their information. This fleet of treasure carracks was heading for Flores at the northern end of the Azores Islands. Naturally, with that kind of information in hand, Lord Clifford did what any reasonable commander would do in that position. He sent his ships south. Those ships in the south got up to all sorts of mischief. They were raiding towns and capturing ships and generally causing a very loud and noticeable sort of ruckus. It was the sort of ruckus that would draw the eyes of a Spanish fleet that had been sent to deal with the pirates, the sort of ruckus that any respectable commander would be forced to respond to. They had to go down there to engage and fight and kill the pirates that were busy burning their way across their territory. Meanwhile, up to the north, Sir George Clifford, the Earl of Cumberland, was waiting. Last time we talked about the Elizabethan gentlemen adventurers, names like Richard Hawkins, William Hawkins, Walter Raleigh, George Clifford, the Earl of Cumberland, and James Lancaster. All of them were privateers and, to one degree or another, contemporaries of Francis Drake. We talked about their roles in the 1588 battle against the Spanish Armada, and the voyage that was organized by Lord Clifford to raid Spanish and Portuguese shipping in the Atlantic. When we left off, they had just received word of an incoming flotilla of large Portuguese treasure carracks headed for Flores Island. That included the largest ship in the Portuguese Navy, very possibly the largest ship in the world, Madre de Dios. Let's join them now in the northern Azores at the beginning of August 1592. This is episode 126. Pirates Incorporated, Part 2. That Portuguese flotilla was still a week or two away at best. The English chose to go ashore there at Flores and see if they had anything to trade. They landed around 100 men and found the people of the town barricaded inside the church with their few guns pointed at their enemies, the English. Remember, they were at war here. But Richard Hawkins marched into the center of town holding aloft a white flag. The grandees of Flores came out to meet with him, and Hawkins made it clear that they had no intent of violence here. Instead, what they were after was food and water. If available, they would certainly trade for wine or perhaps some ale, but supplies were his mission. Now, you should remember that the Spanish Empire didn't really pay for things. They would take what they needed, and the people would be reimbursed by the crown. They would get paid, but only whatever the government thought they were owed. The Englishmen, on the other hand, had hard coin to spend. So they and the people of Flores were suddenly great friends. Over the next week, the English would occasionally bring in captives from one or another of the small ships that they captured, and they weren't after the cargo there. They were just there to make sure that the crews of those vessels wouldn't be able to carry word of their presence to the flotilla. And on some level, the people of Flores Island were complicit in that. I imagine there was kind of a fun little dance going on here. The English marching their captives into town, locking them up in a warehouse or wherever. Then one of the local leaders would come in with food, looking all sad-eyed, and say, "Oh, it's terrible, Captain. They have our women, and they took all of our money. They're eating us out of house and home. But they say that they'll leave soon, leave us alone, and that you can go free." Meanwhile, Hawkins and the mayor were busy dining together of an evening. Then again, this account is all suspect. It's given to us by a single source, a man to whom we owe the greatest debt for this whole story, but a man who is not the most trustworthy. Richard Heyklut was many things, a statesman, a writer, a priest even, but also a liar. He was the personal chaplain to two monarchs, Elizabeth and James I, and his writings were always in the interest of England, but not necessarily in the interest of history or truth or fact. So maybe the people of Flores were suffering. Maybe they were living under the English boot. But even if that was true, they didn't have long to worry. By 1st August, the whole fleet was mustered off the coast of Flores Island. And the command makeup of this fleet is interesting. John Burrow was the admiral. He'd been the Vice Admiral when the fleet left England about 2 months ago, and then the First Admiral, Sir Walter Raleigh, was recalled almost immediately. The replacement for Walter Raleigh was Martin Frobisher, but Walter Raleigh split the fleet up. So even though Frobisher was technically in command of the entire armada, it was really 2 separate commands, with Burrough in command of 1 unit. Even in that case, though, Martin Frobisher had been chased back to England by a Spanish fleet just a few weeks ago. If we were to follow the chain of command, John Burrough would be the admiral, and he was by name, but there were some other very big personalities at work here. The biggest of these was Sir George Clifford, 3rd Earl of Cumberland. He was the one who'd organized the fleet. More than anyone else, he was responsible for its existence. He was the Queen's champion. He was a lord, an earl with an old and famous name, and he was a famous jousting champion. But he was here, on board the deck of a ship out in the Atlantic, because that wasn't enough. George Clifford wanted to be a privateer. He wanted to be a gentleman adventurer, which was all the rage at the time. Clifford was something of an eccentric. He took on the family title relatively young, and then very quickly gambled away most of his family fortune. He earned some of it back, entering tournaments and winning prizes. However, he was doing that down in the south. His ancestral castle in the north was falling into disrepair while he was busy jousting. In fact, that marked the beginning of the castle's fall into ruin. Now, George Clifford wasn't particularly popular with the men of the court. They found him to be braggadocious, kind of a peacocking young lord with less sense than was good for him. On the other hand, George Clifford was very popular with the women of the court. He was handsome and dashing. He was witty and funny. He was the kind of guy who was known to lose and win fortunes all on a whim. He was very, very far from the high medieval chivalric ideal, but he was still the sort of man that made nearly every lady in the court pray that he would carry her favor into the tilt. That is, of course, until the Queen herself blessed him with her favor. After that, he could ask for no greater honor. Of course, there were other blessings that he hoped for from the women of the court that the Queen could not fulfill. George Clifford was married, as was proper, but that didn't stop him. I imagine it's got to be fairly difficult to navigate the sexual politics of the Elizabethan court when you're the Queen's champion. Certain women of the court were off limits, some of them because Elizabeth hated them. An affair with one of those ladies could be dangerous to his health, perhaps exciting, but maybe not worth the trouble. There were other women in the court that Elizabeth would politely ignore, but I mean, where's the fun in that? And then there were those who were off limits because Elizabeth was saving them for a beneficial match. I imagine that those must have been particularly exciting conquests. The Lord earned some renown in the 1588 battle against the Spanish Armada, not for naval prowess, however. He brought in a number of ships to the battle, which was very appreciated by the command, and he even commanded one himself, but to no distinction whatsoever. With that in mind, it's worthy of note that on this privateering voyage into the Atlantic, he didn't have the kind of ego that would assume he was best for command. He knew that he needed an experienced commander. He knew that a privateer should be at the helm here. And that was the case with John Burrough, Martin Frobisher, and Walter Raleigh, but all the same. At least 3 of the ships off Flores Island were his personal property. He paid for a disproportionate amount of food and ammunition. If you were a captain on this voyage, even if you were the admiral, you'd very likely still ask his opinion. But there were other large personalities vying for attention here. The commander of the Golden Dragon, for instance, Captain Christopher Newport. Newport, in truth, deserves his own episode, and he might get one someday. I love Christopher Newport, kind of in the same way that I like a character like Teddy Roosevelt. There's a fair amount of stuff in his story that should make us take pause and reflect. But there's no time, man! Not when you're facing this giant, one-armed, hook-handed, bearded pirate, the kind of guy who claps you on the back just a little too hard, the kind of guy who encourages you to drink just a little too much. You notice that your girlfriend plays with her hair a lot when he's around, and by the end of the night, he's killed a guy in a duel. But it's all in good fun. And then in the morning, he's off on another adventure to the ends of the earth, ready to take a bite out of the day, and you're nursing the worst hangover of your life. Newport was the sort of sailor that walked that line between pirate and privateer for years, and at least in his youth, he was never afraid to step over that line. His earliest commands were in the Anglo-Spanish War, and he spent a lot of that time in the West Indies. He made contacts in the Americas, in both Spanish and Native American territories. He menaced Hispaniola and Cuba in the Windward Passage. And on his largest command in the West Indies, the voyage on which he captured the Golden Dragon, who would you imagine paid for a large percentage of that voyage? Sir Francis Drake, of course. It was in his honor and in the memory of Golden Hind that he christened his new ship Golden Dragon. I think I am going to keep Captain Christopher Newport in my back pocket. Otherwise, this would very likely turn into an episode about Christopher Newport, and when we do talk about him, I want to give his story the time it deserves. The second Admiral of the fleet, Martin Frobisher, was a pirate, out and out. As in, a few years before the outbreak of war between Spain and England, he was arrested and investigated on suspicion of outfitting ships for piracy. In the years leading up to the war, he operated mostly in the Spanish Netherlands, capturing mostly Spanish vessels. They weren't the kind of grandiose raids for which Drake would become so famed, but it was honest work. Or, not honest work, but you get what I'm saying here. He took hauls of wine and linen, a few luxury goods here and there, maybe a bag of silver, but nothing huge. But when war broke out with Spain, located largely in his old stomping grounds in the Netherlands, his years of experience found him a place in the ranks of respectable naval commanders. You can see why Spain called England a nation of pirates. The current admiral of the fleet, John Burrough, was one of those respected naval commanders. Richard Heyklut would write of those commanders and of Captain Burrough specifically, quote, "The gentlemen, to give them their right, were so well qualified in courage, experience, and discretion as the greatest prince might repute himself happy to be served with their like. The honor of lieutenant general was imposed upon Sir John Burrough, a gentleman, for his manifold good and heroic parts, thought every way worthy of that command." End quote. Men who were long-time pirates and privateers, suddenly qualified in courage, experience, and discretion. Remember, in the interest of England, not in the interest of history. But in the case of John Burrough, that's mostly what we have to go on. In fact, outside of this voyage, there's not much on him. John Burke's peerage lists the dates of his birth and wedding, his knighthood and his death, and all that's nice, but it hardly compares to the profiles for the other men we've talked about today. But that will all make sense in time. For now, let's turn to 3rd August 1592. Off the coast of Flores Island, the remaining English fleet waited for the arrival of 5 Portuguese carracks. They'd been informed of the incoming fleet by some liberated Barbary slaves, and they knew they were coming right their way. The fleet was spread out before Flores Island in a net that was intended to capture any Portuguese vessels on approach. The ships were all placed about 2 leagues apart, roughly 7 miles or 11 kilometers. In my mind, I imagine that as being far enough apart that they would have needed spyglasses to see one another, but that's not the case. They didn't have telescopes yet. The first verifiable telescopic patent wouldn't come around for another 16 years. And Galileo would make use of them, but even then they were still the stuff of optics labs and scientific curios until the late 1600s, when Sir Isaac Newton made some serious improvements. Even Well, it's unlikely that William Dampier would have had a telescope on his first few voyages, but it's entirely possible that he would have had one on his latter missions. He was kind of a science geek after all. But they didn't find any widespread maritime use until the War of the Spanish Succession. The obvious tactical advantage couldn't be ignored. What I'm getting at here is that when you picture them in your mind, they were still pretty far apart, but they weren't on the edge of the horizon. They would have to be close enough to see the nearest ship and see if they raised a flag. Imagine a spider web with 7 spiders that were waiting to catch any passing flies. A spider web that stretched the length of Flores Island. And I say any passing flies, but let's be clear here, they were only ever really after one particularly fat fly, Madre de Dios. The 7 spiders in question were arrayed from south to north as follows. Dainty, under Captain Richard Hawkins, was the furthest south. A few leagues to the north we find Captain Christopher Newport on Golden Dragon. Admiral John Burrough was yet farther north in Roebuck, a ship owned by the Queen. Lord Clifford's 3 vessels came next, Tiger, Samson, and Prudence in that order. And then furthest north was another of the Queen's ships, the Foresight, under Captain Robert Cross. We haven't talked about Robert Cross yet, but we will. The wind was blowing in such a fashion that it took about 2 hours to get from the location of one ship to the next. There were 2 hours between Dainty and Golden Dragon. There were 4 hours between Dainty and Roebuck. By that logic, it would take a full 12 hours for Foresight and Dainty to meet, assuming that one of them stayed in place. About midday on the 3rd, a lookout on board Richard Hawkins' Dainty, the southernmost ship, spotted Madre de Dios coming their way. Hawkins sent up a flag to notify the lookouts on Golden Dragon. It worked kind of like, well, the best analogy I can think of are the beacons between Gondor and Rohan in The Lord of the Rings. And I'm sure there's a better analogy out there, but look, I just watched the whole trilogy this weekend, the extended editions even, so that's why we spent last time talking about Morgoth, and I tell you, I had to fight off the urge to talk about Shelob when we were talking about spiders and webs. But that's how it worked. After Dainty raised her flag, Golden Dragon caught wind of it and raised her own flag. Roebuck saw it and raised her flag, and then it went on and on. Within only a few minutes, all 7 vessels were aware of the Madre de Dios. However, they didn't plan on the Carrack being this far south. They thought that she would come in further to the north, which meant that they would have at least 2 vessels that could intercept her at once, ready to fight immediately. In this situation, though, if they were to catch her, Dainty would be all alone for 2 hours. Alone against the largest and one of the most powerful ships in the whole world. Still, Captain Hawkins was no coward. Dainty sailed in to engage. Now, Hawkins had to play this carefully. Dainty was fast and well-armed for her size, but she was nothing compared to this Portuguese monster. It was going to be a delicate operation. For obvious reasons, he had to avoid getting hit, but in addition to that, Hawkins had to avoid hitting Madre de Dios too hard. I mean, it's unlikely that he could have sunk Madre de Dios, but that's not the issue here. The real issue was keeping that ship away from the shore. If you'll recall from last time, the last major ship that this fleet attempted to capture ran aground at top speed on purpose. The crew carried off all of the valuable cargo, and then they burned that ship down. If the Portuguese attempted that again, and they were likely to, this entire operation would be for naught. So Hawkins' entire job here was to keep moving, to keep himself between Madre de Dios and the shoreline. He had to keep her occupied, but at the same time he had to appear as though his ship were not too much of a threat. He did so for 2 hours until Captain Newport arrived in Golden Dragon. Even with 2 ships, though, they were still in perilous danger of losing their prize, perhaps in even greater danger. Compared to Madre de Dios with her 700 men and an impressive complement of guns, Dainty was dainty. She was nothing but a fly to be swatted away, but once Golden Dragon arrived, it showed the Portuguese captain that this could turn into a dangerous situation. He might find it imperative to make for the shore. So they danced. The English circled their prey like sharks. They fired around whenever it was safe to do so, but mostly they employed small arms fire and the swivel guns, and they focused on one particular spot on Madre de Dios, the helm. If you were trying to keep Madre de Dios from maneuvering too much or making their way to shore, the helm is where you wanted to focus your fire. Now, Dainty did take a hit in the fighting. She lost her foremast, but right about that time the Roebuck arrived to relieve her. Dainty limped off to lick her wounds, and the Roebuck and Golden Dragon continued to encircle Madre de Dios. There's something to point out here, though. Madre de Dios had a crew of over 700 men. If a crewman on board was injured or killed, or if someone grew exhausted, they had replacements. The English ships, mostly, did not. You know, it's entirely possible that Dainty could have avoided that shot that she took if the crew hadn't already been fighting for 4 hours. They might just have grown exhausted with no relief to take over. In 2 more hours, the Golden Dragon might just take a hit right about the time another ship showed up. It was possible that this pattern could continue and the English would lose. And with hindsight, we know that they had quite a fight ahead of them. Still 12 hours to go. Luckily, another ship did not take a serious hit. Over the next several hours, the firefight continued. Lord Clifford showed up with his ship Tiger, and his other 2 ships followed, and then Dainty, once repaired, re-entered the fight. And it was here that the whole game changed. At this point, there was virtually no question that the English could take down Madre de Dios in a straight-up fight, but they didn't want to take her down. At this point, they had to focus all of their energy on not doing too much damage here. They had to walk a tight line. See, they obviously didn't want to sink her or run her aground. They wanted to disable Madre de Dios, but they didn't want to disable her too much. They needed her to be seaworthy. They were intending to sail her back to England. If they tried to transfer all of the cargo on Madre de Dios, that would take time, and they might not even be able to fit all of that on their ship. That would give the Spanish Armada time to sail in and to kill them all. If they damaged Madre de Dios too much, it would take time to repair her, which would give the Spanish Armada time to sail in and kill them all. So they played it safe. They kept their shots away from the masts. They kept their shots away from the magazine. Instead, they focused almost entirely on chain shot into the rigging and small arm fire at the helm. Let's, for a moment, look at what things would have been like on board the Carrack, specifically at the helm here. Madre de Dios was a monster of a ship, and this was in a time when ship technology was still relatively rudimentary compared to what we know and love. Optimally, it would take 12 or 14 men at the helm to steer a ship of that size. All of them were grouped up in one spot right there at the helm. Imagine standing there, straining to control this giant vessel when a hail of red-hot iron balls tears through you and your comrades. Maybe you don't take a hit, and you might consider yourself lucky, but on the other hand, the lucky might be those who took a hit through the head. Most of the men who got hit were on deck screaming and bleeding and trying to hold their insides in. In fact, maybe it's better not to imagine yourself at the helm. Maybe you're a gunner, working somewhere else on the vessel, but you see what happened up there. Through the smoke, you saw showers of blood and screams. And then the orders come down, you need to get up there and work the helm. But before you can even get there and start your job, you have to help drag away the dead and dying men. And you have to do so you can take their place, to stand where they stood when that happened. To stand in the blood and the bone and the brains and the excrement. The greatest blessing you can find in all of this is that the smoke fills your nostrils so you don't have to smell that. And then once again, the English hit your position. A red-hot iron ball tears through your thigh. If you're lucky, that ball will tear through your femoral artery and you will bleed to death in only a few minutes. That cycle continued for 12 hours. The English had a vested interest in killing every man that was sent to the helm, but the Spanish had a vested interest in having men work the helm of their ship. Eventually, though, the Foresight arrived with a fresh crew and Robert Cross. Cross and Burrow and Lord Clifford all met to confer, while Hawkins and Newport kept up the fight. Those three all agreed that the firefight could not continue with any hope of successfully recovering Madre de Dios. Cross's crew was fresh. They were rested. They were ready to fight. So he volunteered to lead the boarding party. Everybody agreed to that, but Cross didn't have enough men. The best crew to back him would be the crew of Golden Dragon, Newport's men, and they went with him too. Roebuck, Tiger, Dainty, and all of the rest opened up a full bombardment on Madre de Dios. They forced the gunners of the Portuguese ship to take cover, while Golden Dragon and Foresight sailed in close. They grappled Madre de Dios, and they sent their men over the side. The fighting was fierce. There was a surge of resistance against the English, and fighting quickly spread throughout all 7 decks of Madre de Dios. But the battle had already been going on for 16 hours. The fight was brief. The Portuguese were exhausted, and at least half of the Englishmen had not yet had to fight. In the hours that it took them to reach Madre de Dios from their position, many of them probably had a nap. In short order, the English held the Madre de Dios. They gathered up all of the prisoners on deck, but they did a sweep of the vessel as well. That's just good sense, to make sure that nobody's hiding, make sure that nobody's planning an ambush or some sort of sabotage. But the men on that sweep who found the hold of Madre de Dios quickly realized exactly what it was that they had fought so hard for. There was more valuable cargo on board right there than any of these men had seen in their entire lives. They were all going to be rich. However, there was a somber note in the air. Richard Heyklut writes, quote, "But albeit this first appearance of the hugeness thereof yielded sights enough to entertain our men's eyes, yet the pitiful object of so many bodies, slain and dismembered, could not but draw each man's eye to see, and heart to lament, and hands to help those miserable people, whose limbs were so torn with the violence of shot, and whose pain was made grievous with the multitude of wounds. No man could almost step but on a dead carcass or a bloody floor, but especially bout the helm, where very many of them fell suddenly from stirring to dying." End quote. At least that's what Heyklut tells us. Everyone else speaks of the orgy of plunder that followed the battle. English crewmen were stuffing their pockets and their purses with gold and rubies and sapphires. And here comes one of those moments that I truly wish I had on film. I mean, I would love actual footage of the real event, but I'd be happy with even some modern Hollywood interpretation. Not the plunder necessarily, although I would love to see the haul all together in the holds, but no, I'm talking about the arrival on deck of George Clifford, the 3rd Earl of Cumberland, the man who paid for and organized this whole voyage. Christopher Newport and Robert Cross, the men who led the party on deck, well, they were already there, but they were busy dealing with the aftermath of battle. They were seeing to the wounded. They were seeing that everyone was taken prisoner and that the ship was well and truly held. Clifford, on the other hand, had a deep, personal, financial interest in this voyage. How do you imagine he would react when he saw the English crewmen emerging on deck with begemmed rings on their fingers, or pearl necklaces, or bags of nutmeg over their shoulders, with purses so stuffed with coins that they were spilling out onto the deck? Clifford was not happy. And if this were some sort of 1930s film, he would probably be all, "By Jove, sirs, in the name of your queen, cease this tomfoolery at once." And then the clouds would part, and the men would see the error of their ways and renounce piracy and become priests, maybe. In reality, the Earl probably grabbed the nearest man by the collar, pulled him face to face, and said, "What do you think you're doing?" Then he threw the man to the deck, drew his personal sword, and all of his personal retainers, knights all of them, drew their swords as well. There would have been a tense moment there on the deck, a moment in which intercompany violence was very, very possible. But of course you don't get paid if you get killed. The crew put the plunder back. There would be later estimates that would suggest that possibly as much as a third of the haul did, in one form or another, sneak away. Clifford got the crew back to work. They needed to repair Madre de Dios. They needed to get the rigging back in shape. But then he and Newport and Hawkins interviewed the Portuguese captain. Part of me is tempted to do an episode within an episode here, to play the music again and tell you, this is episode 126 and a half, the tale of Don Fernando. Because Don Fernando has one of those tales. Instead, I'll just relate what Heyklut tells us. Quote, among the rest of those whose state this chance had made very deplorable was Don Fernando de Mendoca, Grand Captain and Commander of this carrack, a gentleman well stricken in years, well spoken, of comely personage, of good stature, but of hard fortune. In his services against the Moors he was twice taken prisoner. In a former voyage of return from the east he was driven upon the sands, and although escaping the sea danger, yet fell into the hands of the infidels on land, who kept him under long and grievous servitude. The king was content to let him try his fortune on this easterly navigation, and committed unto him the conduct of this carrack, wherein he went from Lisbon, general of the whole fleet. End quote. And now, Don Fernando had been captured once again by infidels. However, George Clifford was not without sympathy. He ordered the guns on board one of his ships moved over to Madre de Dios, along with the cargo of his ship. But he left the tools and food and water on that vessel, and he gave the ship to Don Fernando, as well as the rest of the Spanish. He let them go and return home safely, weather permitting. Well, he was about to let them go. He didn't let them go yet, not until his fleet, including Madre de Dios, was well underway. The repairs were going well here, but they were under pressure. In fact, they were under several pressures. There was a rift developing between the crew and the officers, even between captains. They'd fought and they'd died for this prize, and they were privateers. They were owed a share here. But it was looking more and more like Clifford might try to deny them a share, to pay them a wage. But instead of fighting back, they worked. Because, after all, you can't get paid if you're dead. And the Spanish Armada was on its way. Next time, we're going to conclude the tale of Madre de Dios. But that's not the end of the story. This story won't end for another 3 centuries, because the capture of the Madre de Dios gave birth to something that would change the world forever. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show. All of our patrons on Patreon, everybody who has left us a review or a rating, everybody who has recommended this show. Without all of you, I wouldn't be able to do this. Thank you. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, you absolutely should do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au. That's brillig.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com, or you can get in touch on Twitter, SoundCloud, Reddit, or YouTube. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening.